"You're making a mistake, Mira," David said, his voice a low, indifferent rumble that didn't bother to mask his boredom. He didn't even look up from the mahogany desk. Mira paused at the heavy oak doors, her suitcase handle gripped so tightly her knuckles blanched. "No, David. The mistake was thinking a crown gave you a heart. If you walk out that door, you don't come back. The pack will not accept a runaway Luna. There is no Luna here," she whispered, the quiet finality of her words slicing through the suffocating silence of his study. "Only a ghost you created." The heavy brass latch clicked. The door shut. It was the last time the Alpha King would hear her voice before the silence began to tear him apart. The click of the brass latch did not echo loudly, but in the cavernous expanse of the Alpha's study, it resonated with the finality of a gavel-striking wood. David did not flinch. His posture remained impeccably straight, his broad shoulders squared beneath the immaculate tailoring of his charcoal suit. He merely turned the page of the territorial treaty on his desk, his silver pen hovering over a clause regarding the northern timber reserves. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the Seattle sky wept in torrential sheets. Lightning flashed, casting stark, jagged shadows across the room, illuminating the cold, angular planes of David's face. He was a king built for war and commerce, a man who measured success in leverage and land, not in the fragile, unpredictable currency of human emotion. "She will be back by nightfall," his inner wolf reasoned, entirely devoid of panic. "It is a tantrum, an emotional display meant to solicit a reaction." He refused to give her one. For 3 years, their arranged mating had been a sterile, functional transaction. She provided the pack with a figurehead of grace, and he provided her with the security of the most powerful territory on the West Coast. That she suddenly required warmth, validation, or the mythological romanticism of a true mate bond was, in David's eyes, a breach of their unspoken contract. A soft knock interrupted the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Silas, his beta and chief enforcer, stepped into the room. Silas was a man built like a freight train, yet he moved with the unsettling quiet of a predator. Today, however, there was a visible tension in his jaw. "Alpha," Silas murmured, dipping his chin. "Are the delegations from the river pack secured in their suites?" David asked, his eyes never leaving the document. He crossed out a line of text with a sharp, vicious stroke of his pen. "They are." Silas hesitated, his boots shifting uncomfortably on the Persian rug. "But I just passed Mira in the grand foyer. She was carrying a bag, David, a single duffel. She stepped into a cab." "She is being dramatic, Silas. Let her cool off." "A cab, David," Silas repeated, dropping the formal title, his brow furrowing. "Not a packed car. Not one of her security details." She walked out into a torrential downpour, completely unshielded, and hailed a yellow taxi. Her scent. David finally looked up. His eyes, a striking glacial blue, narrowed. What of her scent? It suppressed, completely flattened. Silas said quietly, "If I hadn't seen her with my own eyes, I wouldn't have known she was in the building. She's masking." A fleeting, microscopic fracture appeared in David's stoic composure before he ruthlessly sealed it shut. Masking was a survival tactic, a biological response triggered only when a wolf felt severely threatened or was attempting to vanish entirely from predators. Why would she mask her scent in her own home? "She is trying to make a point," David stated coldly, placing his pen down. "She wants me to chase her down the driveway, like some love-struck adolescent in a cheap movie. I will not indulge it." We have a summit tomorrow that will determine the economic stability of 3 territories. That is my priority. That is..." Silas stared at his king for a long, heavy moment. The beta had been by David's side through bloody coups and hostile corporate takeovers. He knew the alpha was a tactical genius. But in this moment, Silas looked at David as if he were staring at a fool. "Mira has never been dramatic," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Not once in 3 years. She has endured the council's whispers, the rival pack's insults, and your distance with absolute perfect grace. Watch your tone, Beta." David's voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating hum. "I am watching my pack," Silas countered, holding his ground, though his wolf instinctively submitted to the sheer, crushing weight of David's aura. "You rely on her more than you calculate, Alpha." The River Pack delegates only agreed to this meeting because Mira spent the last 6 months sending handwritten correspondence to their Luna, checking on their sick pup. She bridged the gap you ignored. I secured the bridge with leverage. Her letters were merely pleasantries. David stood, buttoning his suit jacket with mechanical precision. "Have security track the taxi's plates. When she realizes she cannot access her black cards or her trust without pack authorization, she will return. Until then, we do not speak of this." Silas nodded slowly, backing out of the room. "As you command, Alpha." When the door clicked shut again, David was left utterly alone. He walked to the crystal decanter on the sideboard, pouring 3 fingers of neat scotch. As he raised the glass, he inhaled. The penthouse's ventilation system was state-of-the-art, constantly filtering the air. Already the faint, lingering scent of jasmine and white tea, Mira's scent, was being systematically scrubbed from the room, replaced by the sterile smell of ozone and polished wood. David drank the scotch. It burned all the way down, but it did nothing to warm the sudden, inexplicable chill settling deep within his chest. 72 hours. In the high-stakes world of lichen politics and corporate dominance, 3 days was enough time to topple a regime, orchestrate a merger, or start a border war. For Alpha King David, it was the exact amount of time it took for the meticulously constructed machinery of his life to begin grinding its gears. He sat at the head of the colossal mahogany dining table. It was 7 in the morning. The sprawling room was silent, save for the nervous shuffling of a young Omega maid pouring his coffee. David took a sip and immediately slammed the porcelain cup down, the sharp clatter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The maid flinched, nearly dropping the silver carafe. "What is this?" David demanded, his voice dangerously soft. "Pike Place roast, Alpha. Exactly as you requested." The girl was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "It is bitter. It tastes like battery acid." I brewed it exactly the same way, I swear it," she stammered. "Luna Mira usually pours it for you. I didn't see what she did to it." David paused. The irritation simmering beneath his skin snagged on that detail. He waved the maid away with a curt flick of his wrist. She scurried from the room, leaving him alone with the bitter drink. He stared at the black liquid. For 3 years, his morning coffee had been perfect. He had never once asked Mira to prepare it. She simply was always awake before him, sliding the cup across the table as he read the Financial Times. He had assumed she just handed him what the staff made. He hadn't realized she was altering it, adding exactly a single drop of local honey, just enough to cut the acidity without making it sweet. A detail he had never vocalized, yet she had noticed. He pushed the cup away. The void she left behind was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing drain of color and efficiency from his world. By noon, the Vanguard Council meeting was a disaster. 10 alphas from the surrounding territories sat in David's glass-walled boardroom. Tensions were already high due to the recent rogue attacks on the eastern borders. Usually, Mira sat at his right hand. She rarely spoke, but her presence was a masterclass in psychological de-escalation. She would offer a soft smile to a defensive alpha, pour water for a thirsty delegate, or subtly touch David's wrist beneath the table when his aggression spiked too high. Without her, the room was a powder keg, and David was holding the match. "Your tax proposals on our supply lines are extortion, David." Alpha Thorne snarled, slamming a meaty fist on the table. Thorne was an older, aggressive wolf who smelled of cheap cigars and stale blood. "It is a tariff for the security my patrols provide your miserable stretch of highway," David replied flawlessly, his face a mask of carved ice. "If you cannot afford it, perhaps you cannot afford to rule." Thorne's eyes flashed gold. "Don't lecture me on ruling when you can't even keep your own house in order. Where is your better half, David? Got tired of freezing to death in your bed?" A deafening silence slammed into the room. David didn't move, but the air pressure in the boardroom plummeted. The glass windows groaned under the sudden, suffocating weight of his alpha aura. Several younger wolves at the table visibly choked, clutching their throats. Thorne bared his teeth, trying to resist the biological command to submit, sweat beading on his forehead. "My wife's whereabouts," David said, his voice echoing with the dual, monstrous resonance of his wolf, "are not subject to council discussion. Sign the treaty, Thorne, or I will absorb your territory by midnight." Thorne signed, his hands shaking with rage. The meeting ended, but the victory tasted like ash. As the delegates filed out, Silas remained. "That was reckless," Silas said quietly. "Thorne will comply today, but he will plot tomorrow. Mira would have. Mira is not here." David cut him off, the icy composure snapping back into place. "And she is still not answering her phone. Have the trackers found the cab?" The cab dropped her off at a crowded metro station in the city center. No cameras inside the terminals. She vanished into the rush hour crowd. "David, she hasn't touched her bank accounts. Her credit cards are still on her vanity." David's jaw tightened. "Keep looking." Leaving the boardroom, David bypassed his office and walked toward the residential wing. He needed to understand the mechanics of the situation. If she hadn't taken his money, how was she surviving? He pushed open the double doors to their master's suite. The room was immaculate. It looked like a museum exhibit of a modern luxury bedroom. He walked toward her massive walk-in closet and threw the doors open. He expected it to be empty. Instead, a wave of confusion hit him. The closet was full. Rows of glittering designer gowns, silk blouses, and tailored coats hung in perfect color-coordinated lines. The glass display cases held the diamond tennis bracelets, the sapphire earrings, and the platinum watches he had instructed his assistants to buy for her on birthdays and anniversaries. She hadn't taken a single thing he had given her. Frowning, David stepped deeper into the closet. He reached the far corner, where she kept her casual wear. It was entirely bare. The faded denim, the worn cotton sweaters she wore when she thought he wasn't looking, the scuffed brown boots she brought with her 3 years ago, gone. His eyes drifted to the small, velvet-lined vanity in the center of the closet. Sitting perfectly in the center of the glass was a silver chain. David approached it slowly, his heart giving a strange, irregular thud. It was the mating necklace, the heavy silver crest of his pack that he had clasped around her neck on their wedding day, a symbol of his protection and her submission. The chain wasn't unclasped. It was broken, snapped violently in half. Beside the broken metal lay a thick, leather-bound notebook. David reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool leather. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Date, October 14th. Intercepted poison gift basket meant for David. Bribe the courier for the source. Handled. Date, November 2nd. Alpha Thorns Beta planning a media leak regarding David's offshore accounts. Purchased the media company under a shell LLC. Handled. Date, January 18th. David exhausted. Arranged for silence on the executive floor. Masked the PAC's financial dip from the elders by selling my personal shares from my mother's estate. Handled. David stopped breathing. Page after page, date after date, detailing hundreds of fires she had quietly put out behind his back to ensure his reign looked flawless. She hadn't just been smiling at diplomats. She had been the invisible shield holding up his entire empire, and he hadn't noticed a single thing. He stared at the broken silver chain, the absolute silence of the empty bedroom suddenly roaring in his ears. The ledger felt heavier than a block of solid iron in David's hands. He stood in the center of the cavernous closet, the broken silver mating chain resting in his palm beside the leather-bound book. The silence of the penthouse, usually a testament to his supreme control over his environment, now felt like a vacuum slowly pulling the oxygen from his lungs. He read the entries again. Handled. 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 For 3 years, he had believed himself the solitary pillar holding up the West Coast like an empire. He had looked at Mira's quiet compliance and seen only a dull, necessary ornament. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her grace for a lack of substance. Instead, she had been a shadow moving beneath his throne, quietly catching the daggers aimed at his back, bleeding in secret so his reign remained pristine. A low, involuntary growl rattled in his chest, a sound he hadn't made outside of combat in a decade. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined, militaristic force within his mind, began to pace frantically, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. The wolf did not care about ledgers or corporate stability. It only knew that the den was empty, the mate was gone, and the scent of jasmine was fading into nothingness. The bedroom door clicked open. Silas stepped in, pausing at the threshold. The beta's eyes darted from the empty casual wear section to the broken chain in David's hand. The trackers lost the taxi at King Street Station. Silas reported, his voice low, cautious. She paid the driver in cash. From there, the cameras show her entering the underground terminal. But the exit footage is corrupted. A localized grid failure that lasted exactly 4 minutes. Just long enough for her to vanish. David didn't turn around. His thumb traced the jagged edge of the broken silver link. She planned this. This was not a tantrum. It was a tactical retreat. Alpha? David turned, his glacial blue eyes burning with a sudden, terrifying intensity. He tossed the ledger to Silas. The burly enforcer caught it, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. As Silas read, the colors slowly drained from his face. Goddess above. Silas breathed, looking up in shock. The media leak in November. I had a dozen men looking for the source. We thought it was a rogue element. She bought the whole company? Under a shell LLC I didn't even know she possessed, David said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating frequency. She didn't just walk away, Silas. She dismantled her presence in my life with the precision of an assassin. And I let her. David stalked past his beta, grabbing his charcoal overcoat from the bed. Mobilize the ghost unit. Silas froze. The ghost unit was a Tier 1 Black Ops team, utilized only for high-value target extraction during territory wars. David, that's 6 of our most lethal trackers. To deploy them within the city limits without council approval. It's an act of war. We are at war, Beta. David snapped, shrugging on the coat, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. Just not the one I thought. She has a 4-hour head start. She has no pack protection, and she's masked her scent. If Thorn or any of the rival factions realize she is out there, vulnerable and unprotected, they will use her to break me. She survived under our noses for 3 years doing this, Silas pointed out, holding up the ledger. She might not be as vulnerable as you think. She is my wife, David snarled, the command alpha tone slipping into his voice, causing the glass fixtures in the room to tremble. And she is out there alone. I want the grid failure at the station traced. I want every cash transaction in a 5-mile radius analyzed. She left her cards, which means she's operating on physical currency. Find the paper trail. For the next 6 hours, the opulent penthouse transformed into a tactical command center. David stood over a digital map projected onto his glass desk, watching the blue dots of his ghost unit scour the city. His jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. Every time his phone buzzed, a spike of adrenaline shot through his veins, only to curdle into bitter disappointment when it was a business associate rather than a lead. He thought of their wedding day, a cold, rainy afternoon in November. The Vanguard Council had mandated the Union to merge their bloodlines. He remembered standing at the altar, reciting the ancient vows with the mechanical detachment of reading a quarterly earnings report. When he had placed the heavy silver chain around her neck, she had looked up at him. Her eyes, a warm, striking amber, had held a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps. He had crushed it instantly, turning away to shake hands with a diplomat before she could even smile. He had spent 36 months building a fortress of indifference around himself, believing love was a vulnerability that would cost him his crown. Alpha. A voice crackled over the secure comms unit on the desk. It was Jax, the ghost unit lead. We found a breadcrumb. The grid failure at the station was caused by a localized EMP device. Military grade. You can't buy those on the street. Where did she get it? David demanded, leaning over the microphone. That's the thing, Alpha. There's only one broker in Seattle who deals in that kind of untraceable tech. Jax hesitated, the static hissing in the silence. Elias, down in the Cobalt District. David's blood ran cold. The Cobalt District was the Barrens, a lawless, neon-drenched slum that bordered the docks, overrun by rogue shifters, exiled vampires, and human criminals. Pack law did not apply there. It was a meat grinder. Get a car ready, David ordered Silas, stripping off his suit tie and throwing it onto the desk. The meticulous corporate king was gone. In his place stood the apex predator that had conquered the West Coast. We are going to the Barrens. The rain in the Cobalt District didn't wash away the grime. It only seemed to dilute it into a toxic soup that coated the cracked pavement. The air here was heavy with the scent of ozone, rotting fish from the nearby docks, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was a place designed for things that wanted to remain hidden. David's black SUV idled in front of a heavily fortified storefront. The neon sign above the steel-reinforced door flickered sporadically, buzzing with a faulty electrical hum. It read, Antiquities and Repairs. Silas killed the engine. Elias doesn't bow to alphas, David. He's an old badger shifter, neutral territory. If you go in there throwing your aura around, he'll burn the place down with us inside rather than talk. I am aware of how to negotiate, David said coldly. He stepped out into the torrential rain, ignoring the umbrella his security detail offered. The cold water soaked through his expensive wool coat, but he barely registered the physical discomfort. The psychological knot in his chest was tightening with every passing second. He pushed open the heavy steel door. A bell chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound in the dim, smoke-filled shop. The interior was a labyrinth of towering shelves crammed with everything from ancient Lycan spellbooks to modern, illegal cybernetics. Behind a cage of thick, bulletproof glass sat Elias. The old badger shifter was hunched over a workbench, a jeweler's loop screwed into his right eye, meticulously cleaning a vintage revolver. He didn't look up as David and Silas approached the counter. "We're closed," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on rust. "I need information, Elias," David said, keeping his voice carefully leveled, suppressing the monstrous roar of his wolf that demanded he tear through the glass. Elias finally paused. He slowly lifted his head, his dark, beady eyes locking onto David. The old shifter sniffed the air, a sneer curling his scarred upper lip. "Alpha King David. I'd say it's an honor, but I'd be lying. Your kind of trouble is the kind that ends up on the evening news. I don't deal in loud problems. I am looking for a woman," David said, sliding a thick stack of $100 bills under the small slot in the glass. "Amber eyes, dark hair. She came to you for an EMP device earlier today." Elias glanced at the money, then laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He didn't touch the cash. "You alphas. You think every door opens with fear or green paper? She didn't buy the EMP with money, Your Majesty." David's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Then what did she trade?" Elias leaned back, pulling the loop from his eye. "She came in here looking like a ghost, soaked to the bone, shivering, but holding herself like she was walking to the gallows. She wanted a complete digital wipe. Ghost identity, untraceable transit passes, and the EMP to cover her tracks at the station." "What did it cost?" David demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Elias reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a small velvet pouch and dumped its contents onto the metal tray in the pass-through slot. David's breath hitched. Lying on the cold steel was a delicate, antiquated gold locket. It was scuffed and worn, completely out of place among the high-tech gear in the shop. David recognized it instantly. It was the only possession Mira had brought with her from her life before their marriage. It held a picture of her late parents. She never took it off, wearing it hidden beneath her designer clothes. She pawned her past to buy her future. Elias said softly, watching David's face pale. "I told her it was a raw deal. I told her the tech she wanted was worth 10 times the gold in that trinket." "You know what she said?" David couldn't speak. He stared at the locket, the physical manifestation of her desperation. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "She said it didn't matter," Elias continued, his tone devoid of pity. "She said she was entirely bankrupt anyway. Not in her wallet, Alpha. In here." Elias tapped his chest. "She said she'd rather walk into the dark with nothing than spend one more day freezing to death in a king's shadow." The words struck David like physical blows. The immaculate, impenetrable armor he had worn for 3 years fractured violently, the cracks spider-webbing across his psyche. Freezing to death. Where did she go? David asked, his voice suddenly hollow, stripped of its imperious edge. He slid a second massive stack of bills into the slot, pushing it toward the locket. "Take it all. Give me the locket, and tell me where the transit passes led." Elias scooped up the money and slid the locket across the steel tray. David snatched it, his large fingers closing over the delicate gold. It felt impossibly cold. "I booked her passage on a freighter," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "Leaving from Pier 49, it heads straight into the rogue territories up north. No pact jurisdiction, no laws, just wilderness and wolves who would kill a former Luna for the boots on her feet." Silas swore viciously under his breath. David, the rogue territories. It's suicide. When does the freighter leave? David demanded, spinning on his heel. You're too late, King, Elias called out as they reached the door. It set sail 30 minutes ago. She's gone into the deep water. David burst out into the rain, the heavy steel doors slamming shut behind him. He looked out toward the ink-black expanse of the Puget Sound, the distant horns of cargo ships echoing through the fog. The indifference that had defined his life was entirely gone, replaced by a violent, agonizing tide of regret. He realized, with crushing clarity, that he wasn't just chasing a runaway wife. He was racing against time to save a woman he had inadvertently sentenced to death. The Sikorsky UH-60 helicopter tore through the storm-choked sky, its twin turboshaft engines screaming in protest against the gale-force winds whipping off the Pacific Ocean. Below them, the Puget Sound had transformed into a churning expanse of black water and white foam. David sat in the tactical jump seat, staring down at the violent sea through the rain-streaked glass. The headset pressed over his ears buzzed with the frantic, overlapping chatter of maritime traffic control. But he filtered it out. His right hand remained buried in the pocket of his tactical coat, his thumb tracing the intricate, worn engravings on Mira's gold locket. The metal had finally warmed to his body temperature, but it offered no comfort. It felt like a stolen artifact, a piece of a soul he had recklessly discarded. Alpha. Silas's voice crackled over the secure comms channel. The Beta was strapped into the seat opposite him, a glowing military-grade tablet illuminated in his lap. The Coast Guard has officially scrubbed the search. The storm system is a Category 3 squall. They're calling all civilian and municipal vessels back to port. Then we rely on our own. David replied, his voice a low mechanical rasp that barely carried over the roar of the rotors. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. The impeccable grooming of the corporate king had deteriorated. Dark shadows bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and a rough stubble lined his jaw. Our own are blind out here, David, Silas said, tapping the tablet in frustration. The Iron Wake is a rust bucket. It's running dark. No AIS transponder, no thermal signature over the waves. Elias wasn't lying when he said it was a ghost ship. And we are less than 10 nautical miles from the boundary line. The boundary line. It was the invisible geopolitical border that separated the civilized, council-governed lichen territories from the barrens, the untamed, brutal expanse of the north. For 2 centuries, no reigning alpha had crossed that line without a sanctioned army at his back. To cross it with a single ghost unit and a helicopter was not just reckless. It was an open declaration of war against the warlords who ruled the ice. If we cross that line, Thorne and the Vanguard Council will have the legal precedent to strip you of your title. Silas warned softly, the gravity of the situation etched into every line of his weathered face. You will be a rogue king, an exile. David turned his head from the window, his glacial blue eyes meeting Silas's. There was no hesitation in them. No careful calculation of risk and reward that usually defined his rule. The cold, calculating monarch was dead, hollowed out by the contents of a leather ledger and a pawned necklace. Let them take the crown, David said, the words slipping out with a chilling, absolute finality. Let them take the high-rises, the treaties, and the supply lines. I built a fortress of glass and steel, Silas, and I let the only thing that mattered freeze to death inside it. I will not stop at the boundary, up. Silas stared at his alpha for a long moment, the tablet lowering slightly. He had served David's father before him, had watched David mold himself into a ruthless machine to survive the political vipers of their world. This was the first time in 10 years Silas had seen the man beneath the armor. Before Silas could respond, Jax's voice cut through the static from the cockpit. Alpha, I've got a localized anomaly. A massive electromagnetic spike just washed over the thermal radar, 3 miles north of the boundary. David leaned forward, unbuckling his chest harness. An EMP, exactly like the one Elias sold her. Jax confirmed, banking the helicopters sharply to the right, throwing them against their restraints. It wiped out all digital frequencies in a 2-mile radius. But I caught the epicenter before the radar scrambled. Approaching visual range now. David grabbed the side door handle, his wolf surging against his ribs, snapping its jaws in a frantic frenzy. He shoved the heavy sliding door open. The freezing, torrential rain whipped into the cabin, soaking him instantly. He leaned out into the tempest, the wind trying to tear him from the aircraft. Through the sheet of rain, illuminated by a sudden, jagged fork of lightning, he saw it. The Iron Wake. The freighter was adrift, rocking violently in the massive swells. Its engines were dead, its navigation lights extinguished. But it wasn't alone. Clinging to the sides of the massive rust-streaked hull were 3 sleek, black interceptor skiffs, the kind used by northern rogue packs for piracy and raiding. "They've been boarded," Silas shouted over the wind, drawing his sidearm, his eyes widening in horror. A red flare shot up from the deck of the freighter, painting the dark sky in a hellish crimson glow. In that brief, bloody light, David saw the silhouettes of men fighting on the upper deck. "Get us over that deck!" David roared into the comms, his voice vibrating with a primal, terrifying power. "Bring us down!" "The mast wiring?" Jax started. "Bring us down, Jax, or I will throw you out and fly it myself." David snarled. He ripped off his headset, ignoring protocol, ignoring safety, ignoring the very laws of physics. His wife was on that ship. The helicopter hovered 40 feet above the pitching deck of the Iron Wake, the downwash from the rotors spraying seawater in blinding, horizontal sheets. David didn't wait for the fast rope. He leapt from the cabin, his heavy boots slamming into the slick steel of the cargo deck with enough force to dent the grating. Silas and 2 Ghost Unit operatives landed seconds behind him, assault rifles raised, sweeping the shadows. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the EMP. But beneath it, sharp and undeniable, was the metallic tang of fresh blood. The storm howled, but David's heightened lichen hearing picked up the agonizing groans of the wounded. "Spread out," David commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the storm. No survivors among the rogues. Find her. He moved forward with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. The cargo deck was a slaughterhouse. Bodies of the freighter's human crew lay scattered among the shipping containers. But as David stepped over them, he realized they weren't the only casualties. Slumped against a winch was a massive, scarred rogue wolf. A jagged piece of a broken steel pipe driven straight through his chest. David paused, his brow furrowing. The trajectory of the strike, the precision of the kill. It wasn't the clumsy flailing of a panicked sailor. It was a tactical leverage strike meant to use a larger opponent's momentum against them. He continued up the metal stairwell toward the bridge. Every step felt like walking with lead weights attached to his chest. He was searching for a scent. A whisper of jasmine. He kicked open the door to the bridge. The navigation consoles were smashed, sparking in the dark. In the corner, the human captain of the vessel was bleeding profusely from a deep laceration across his forehead, weakly holding a flare gun. David crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the captain by the collar of his oil-stained jacket and hoisting him to his feet. "Where is she?" David roared, his eyes flashing a brilliant, luminescent gold in the darkness. "The woman with amber eyes. Where is she?" The captain coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the deck. He looked at David with wild, terrified eyes. You're an alpha." I am the king of the West Coast, and you are breathing borrowed air. David snarled, his claws extending, biting into the thick fabric of the man's coat. Where is my wife? We didn't know. The captain wheezed, his hands shaking. She paid in pure gold, kept to the lower cabins. When the rogues hit us, they jammed our radios. They were coming over the rails. We were dead men. The EMP? David prompted, his grip tightening. She blew it, the captain gasped. Fried their skiff engines, fried ours too. But they still boarded. There were too many. We tried to hold the lower deck, but they broke through. The man's voice cracked, tears of pain and terror mixing with the blood on his face. We thought she was just a rich runaway girl. But when they breached the cabin doors, the captain swallowed hard, staring at David in disbelief. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stepped out of the shadows and broke the first boarder's knee with a wrench. She fought like a demon, Alpha. She covered our retreat to the bridge. David felt the air physically leave his lungs. The image the captain painted was utterly incompatible with the quiet, submissive Luna he had ignored for 3 years. She fought. How did she know how to fight? He had never trained her. He had never allowed her near the combat rings. She watched, his inner wolf realized with a sickening jolt. For 3 years she sat quietly in the stands, watching our elites train, studying every strike, every vulnerability, while we thought she was just admiring the violence. Where is she now? Silas demanded, stepping into the bridge, his rifle slung across his chest. They overwhelmed her. The captain whispered, dropping his chin to his chest. There was a massive one, their leader, scented of rotting pine and sulfur. He didn't kill her. He recognized what she was, a Luna. He laughed, tied her, and threw her onto the only skiff they had left with a working engine. David dropped the captain. He slowly turned toward the shattered windows of the bridge, looking out into the pitch-black, raging sea. Rotting pine and sulfur, Silas repeated, the color completely draining from his face. David, that's Kale's scent, the warlord of the Black Ice Pack. David didn't move. He stood frozen, the rain blowing through the broken glass, stinging his face. Kale was a monster, a rogue alpha who had been exiled a decade ago for unimaginable cruelty. Kale didn't just kill his enemies. He broke them psychologically, using them as currency in the lawless North. If Kale knew Mira was David's wife, she was no longer just a runaway. She was the ultimate prize. Tracker, David whispered to Silas, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a terrifying calm settling over him. Alpha, the EMP wiped their electronics. We can't track a single skiff in a Category 3 storm, Silas said, stepping closer. It's a needle in a 1,000-mile haystack. David slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the delicate gold locket. He held it up in the dim light. Get the hounds. Bring my personal tracking unit to the boundary. I don't care if it takes every drop of blood in my body. We are hunting Kale. The Sikorsky helicopter battered its way through the relentless squall, flying dangerously low over the churning black waves of the North Pacific. They had crossed the boundary line 20 minutes ago. The GPS screens on the console had gone completely dark, the satellite signals actively jammed by the ambient, chaotic magnetic fields of the Barrens. They were flying blind into hostile territory. David stood by the open side door, the freezing rain lashing against his tactical armor. He held Mira's worn gold locket in his bare hand, his thumb pressing so hard into the delicate metal it threatened to bend. Beside him crouched Vance, the Ghost Unit's premier tracker, a shifter whose olfactory senses were legendary, currently in his half-shifted state. His eyes glowing a feral, luminescent green in the dim cabin light. The air is saturated with salt and ozone, Alpha. Vance yelled over the deafening roar of the rotors, his nostrils flaring wildly as he leaned out into the tempest. But the locket. The scent is locked in. Jasmine, white tea, and fear. I have the trajectory. Guide jacks, David commanded, his voice a low, mechanical rasp that offered no room for failure. Below them, the jagged, merciless coastline of the rogue territories loomed out of the fog like the teeth of a drowned leviathan. This was a land untouched by council law, a frozen wasteland where exiled warlords ruled over broken packs in a state of perpetual, bloody anarchy. To bring a sanctioned military unit here was to invite an immediate, devastating war. David did not care if the entire continent burned. There, Vance shouted, pointing a clawed finger toward a jagged inlet hidden between two massive, sheer cliffs. Thermal signature fading on the rocks. It's the skiff's engine cooling down. Bring us in, Jax. Silent running. Silas ordered, his face a mask of grim determination as he checked the magazine of his customized assault rifle. The pilot killed the floodlights and cut the engine torque, letting the helicopter drop rapidly toward a narrow strip of frozen pebble beach in a controlled, stomach-churning freefall. The skid slammed into the loose rocks with a violent crunch. Before the aircraft had fully settled, David was out the door, his heavy boots crushing the ice beneath him. The ghost unit fanned out instantly in a flawless diamond formation, weapons raised, sweeping the dense snow-laden tree line that bordered the beach. The interceptor skiff was beached violently on the rocks, its hull deeply gouged. David approached it with the terrifying, silent grace of a shadow. The deck of the small vessel was slick with freezing rain and blood. David stopped. His breath hitched in his chest, a microscopic stutter in his invincible armor. He knelt, pulling off his tactical glove. He pressed his bare fingers to a dark, viscous smear on the aluminum gunnel. It was still warm. It's hers, Vance whispered, materializing beside David. But it's not an arterial spray. It's defensive, a laceration. She fought back. David closed his eyes. The roar of the ocean faded, replaced by the deafening sound of his own heartbeat. For 3 years, he had treated her like porcelain, locking her in a tower of luxury, assuming she was fragile. He had never considered that the cage he built to keep the world out was the very thing suffocating her. She wasn't fragile. She was a survivor he had forced into submission. The trail leads up the cliff face, Vance reported, his head snapping toward a treacherous, nearly vertical goat path winding into the dark forest. Multiple heavy boot prints. Kyle's scent is overwhelming, rotting pine and sulfur. They have a 30-minute head start, Silas said, stepping up beside David. The beta looked up at the looming, hostile wilderness. Kyle's primary stronghold is an abandoned Soviet-era whaling station, 5 miles inland. It's a fortress, David. Concrete walls, reinforced steel, and 100 exiled wolves who have nothing to lose. David stood slowly. He wiped Mira's blood from his fingertips onto his tactical vest right over his heart. When he opened his eyes, the glacial, calculating blue was gone, entirely consumed by the blinding, luminescent gold of a true alpha in a state of primal grief and rage. Then we will leave none of them alive, David said softly. He didn't wait for his unit. David turned and began to ascend the treacherous cliff path at a brutal, punishing pace. He moved through the freezing, wind-whipped forest like an apex predator that had finally slipped its leash. He didn't feel the biting cold. He didn't feel the exhaustion of 48 hours without sleep. He only felt the shape of the void she had left behind, and the absolute, terrifying certainty that if he was too late, he would not survive the silence of an empty throne. The abandoned whaling station rose from the frozen tundra like a rusted mechanical corpse. Massive cylindrical rendering tanks loomed in the darkness, flanked by a sprawling network of concrete processing floors and corrugated steel roofs that groaned in the gale force winds. The scent of ancient, rancid oil was overpowering, meant to mask the smell of the violent outlaws who called it home. David and the ghost unit crested the final ridge overlooking the compound. The storm provided the perfect cover. Rain lashed against the tin roofs, drowning out the sound of their approach. 2 perimeter guards on the catwalk, heat signatures inside the main processing plant. Jax whispered into the secure comms, his thermal sniper scope zeroed in from the tree line. "I have the shot." "Take it," David ordered. 2 suppressed coughs echoed softly from Jax's rifle. On the catwalk, 100 yards away, the 2 massive rogue wolves crumpled silently to the steel grating. "Move," David commanded. They descended upon the compound like phantoms. David didn't bother with his sidearm. He was driven by a feral, agonizing need to feel the bones of his enemies snap beneath his hands. They breached a rusted side door into the labyrinth of the lower levels. The air inside was freezing, thick with the stench of damp fur, stale alcohol, and cheap tobacco. 3 rogues were playing cards in a generator room. They didn't even have time to stand. Silas dropped 2 with a silenced burst to their chests. David crossed the room in a blur of motion, driving his fist into the third man's throat with enough force to crush his larynx instantly. They moved upward, a silent, bloody tide rising through the station. As they reached the heavy, reinforced double doors of the main processing floor, David raised a fist, signaling the unit to hold. The doors were slightly ajar, casting a sliver of harsh, yellow halogen light into the dark corridor. David crept to the gap, his golden eyes narrowing as he looked inside. The processing floor was cavernous. Chains and meat hooks dangled from the high, vaulted ceiling. In the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed rogues, was a rusted steel chair. Mira was tied to it. Her dark hair was plastered to her face with sweat and freezing rain. A jagged cut split her eyebrow, trailing blood down her pale cheek. Her expensive coat had been torn away, leaving her in a thin silk blouse that offered zero protection against the bitter cold. But she wasn't crying. Her chin was lifted, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering defiance that made David's breath catch in his throat. Standing in front of her was Cale. The warlord was a mountain of scarred muscle, his face a roadmap of violent encounters. He wore a heavy wolfskin cloak, leaning casually on a rusted iron pipe. "You're a long way from the high-rises, little Luna," Cale rumbled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Your scent is confusing. Royal blood but smothered, masked, running from the king of the West Coast?" Mira didn't flinch. "I'm not a Luna. I'm just a woman who paid for passage. You have my gold. Let me go." Cale laughed, a cruel, grating sound. He stepped closer, reaching out a filthy hand to grab her chin. David's muscles locked, his claws extending, tearing through the fabric of his tactical gloves. Silas placed a warning hand on David's shoulder, silently begging him to wait for tactical positioning. A woman who fights like a trained soldier, carrying the scent of the most powerful alpha in the country. Kyle mocked, his grip tightening on her face. "No, your leverage. David's territorial expansion has been starving our supply lines for 2 years. If I send him one of your fingers, he'll open the border gates by morning. You don't understand him," Mira said, her voice terrifyingly calm. It wasn't a bluff. It was the absolute crushing certainty of a woman who had spent 3 years studying a man made of ice. Cale frowned, releasing her chin. "I understand alphas. A mate is a weakness. I am not his mate," Mira replied, the words striking David harder than a physical bullet. I was a corporate acquisition, a political merger to satisfy his counsel. He doesn't love me, Cale. He barely notices when I enter a room. For 3 years, I have lived in a glass box while he conquered the coast. David stood frozen in the shadows, his heart shattering against his ribs. Every word was a mirror reflecting the monster he had been. You're lying to save your own skin, Kyle snarled, raising the iron pipe slightly. Send him my finger, Mira challenged, leaning forward against the heavy ropes binding her, her eyes flashing gold. Send him my head. He won't give you a single inch of territory. He will write me off as a lost asset, spin the media to look like a tragic accident, and use my death as a political pretext to finally carpet bomb the barons. I am nothing to him. The silence that followed her statement was absolute. Even the rogue guards shifted uncomfortably, unnerved by the cold, hollow truth in her voice. She believed it. She believed every single word. David looked down at his shaking hands. He had built an empire, secured borders, and crushed rebellions. But in his relentless pursuit of invulnerability, he had systematically destroyed the only piece of his soul that mattered. He had convinced the woman he loved that she was entirely worthless to him. Well, Kyle sighed, raising the heavy iron pipe, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face. If you are truly nothing to him, then no one is coming to save you, and I can have my fun before I send him the pieces. As the iron pipe began its downward arc toward Mira's skull, the heavy steel doors to the processing floor didn't just open. They exploded inward. David stepped through the twisted, smoking metal, his eyes glowing like dying stars, his voice carrying the apocalyptic, resonant roar of a king who had come to burn the world to the ground. Get away from my wife. The heavy steel doors didn't just fall. They crumpled inward like foil, torn off their reinforced hinges by the sheer, devastating force of David's entry. He stepped through the smoke and twisted metal, his charcoal overcoat soaked with freezing rain and the blood of the rogues who had stood in his way. The cavernous processing floor descended into absolute chaos. Cale roared, dropping the iron pipe and lunging forward, his body swelling as he initiated a rapid, partial shift. The rogue warlord was a mountain of scarred muscle, driven by feral instinct. But David was a king forged in the fires of tactical warfare. He didn't meet Cale's wild charge with a roar of his own. He met it with a terrifying, calculated silence. David sidestepped the warlord's massive claws, his own hand shooting out like a piston. He gripped Cale by the throat, the sickening crunch of cartilage echoing over the howling storm outside. Cale choked, his feral yellow eyes widening in sudden, suffocating panic as David's golden gaze burned into his soul. You thought she was leverage, David whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal frequency that forced the remaining rogues in the room to drop to their knees in biological submission. She was your death warrant. With a brutal, flawless twist of his arm, David snapped the warlord's neck. Kyle's massive body went entirely limp, crashing heavily against the blood-stained concrete floor. Behind David, Silas and the ghost unit swept into the room like phantoms. The suppressed, synchronized fire of their weapons made quick work of the remaining guards who dared to raise their rifles. In less than 30 seconds, the deafening violence ceased. The only sound left was the rain hammering against the corrugated roof and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman tied to the steel chair. David turned away from Cale's body. The blinding, luminescent gold of his alpha aura instantly vanished, replaced by the hollow, terrified blue of a man who realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees on the freezing, wet concrete in front of Mira. His hands, which had just flawlessly dismantled a warlord, were violently shaking as he drew a tactical blade. He sliced the heavy, coarse ropes binding her wrists and torso with surgical care. "Mira," he breathed, his voice cracking. He reached out, fully expecting her to collapse forward into the safety of his chest, into the hollow space he had finally realized belonged only to her. She didn't. Mira caught herself on the rusted armrest of the chair. She hissed in pain as blood trickled from the laceration above her brow, but she rigidly pushed herself backward. She planted her feet on the ground and stood up, swaying slightly, deliberately putting a yard of cold, empty air between them. David froze, his hands lingering in the space where she had been. He looked up at her, the physical rejection hitting him harder than any blow Cale could have landed. "I have you," David said softly, desperately, peeling off his heavy, dry tactical coat to wrap around her freezing shoulders. "You're safe now. The unit is securing the perimeter. I am taking you home." Mira pulled the heavy coat tighter around herself, shivering as the adrenaline began to fade. But her amber eyes, locking onto his, were terrifyingly steady. There was no relief in them. There was no love. There was only the profound, exhausted clarity of a woman who had already mourned him. "I don't have a home, David," she said, her voice a quiet, raspy whisper that cut through the cavernous room louder than a scream. "Don't say that," he pleaded, standing up slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the delicate, worn gold locket. He held it out to her, the metal catching the harsh halogen light. "I went to Elias. I bought it back. I found the ledger, Mira. The broken chain. I saw everything you did for me. Everything I was too blind to see. I know I was a fool." Mira looked at the locket resting in his palm. She reached out, her bruised, slender fingers gently taking the necklace from him. She traced the cold metal with her thumb, a bittersweet smile touching her pale lips. "You can buy back the gold, David," she whispered, looking up at him, a single tear cutting a track through the dirt and blood on her cheek. "But you can't buy back the time. You can't buy back the 3 years I spent screaming in a silent room, begging you to just look at me, to just let me in. I was trying to protect you." David lied, his voice breaking. He stepped forward, desperate to close the distance. "I thought if I kept you out of the politics, out of the violence, you would be safe. I built a fortress for you. You didn't build a fortress to protect me, David." She corrected him softly, stepping back again. The absolute certainty in her voice dismantled the last of his defenses. "You built a glass box to protect yourself. You couldn't handle the vulnerability of loving someone, so you locked me away and threw away the key. You didn't freeze me out to keep me safe. You did it because you are a coward." The word struck him with the force of a bullet. Silas, standing a few yards away, lowered his rifle, his face a mask of profound sorrow for his king. The beta knew, in that exact moment, that the war was over, and David had lost. "I can change," David begged. The invincible king of the West Coast entirely shattered, tears finally pooling in his glacial eyes. "I will give you half the council. I will give you whatever you want. Just come back." "I don't want the council. I don't want the crown," Mira said, fastening the locket around her neck. She stood a little straighter, the immense, quiet power she had always possessed radiating from her bruised frame. "The woman who would have died for you. The woman who bled in secret to keep your throne spotless. She died in that penthouse, David. I am not going back to a graveyard." David couldn't breathe. The crushing, suffocating weight of the truth collapsed upon his chest. The title was a prophecy fulfilled. By the time he had learned how to love her, there was nothing left of her love to salvage. Mira turned to Silas, Silas, is the helicopter secure? Yes, Luna. The burly beta replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. I am taking it, Mira commanded, not as a submissive wife, but as a woman who had bought and sold empires in the shadows. You will fly me to the neutral territories of the river pack. I have allies there. They will grant me sanctuary. Silas looked at David, silently asking for orders. David looked at his wife. He saw the jagged cut on her face, the blood on her silk blouse, the unyielding, magnificent fire in her amber eyes. He realized that if he forced her to stay, if he used his power to drag her back to Seattle, he would not be saving his mate. He would be completing Kyle's work. He would be breaking her. David closed his eyes, a single silent tear slipping down his hardened face. Take her, Silas, David ordered, his voice a hollow, defeated whisper. Ensure she has a full guard detail stationed at the border for the rest of her life. Paid from my personal accounts. Mira didn't say thank you. She didn't look back. She walked past the shattered king, stepping out into the freezing, relentless storm, finally free of his shadow. David stood alone in the ruins of the slaughterhouse, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies, realizing he had conquered the entire world, only to end up completely and utterly alone. Thank you for reading this tense, emotional journey. As the title promised, the tragedy of this story lies in the realization that sometimes regret simply arrives too late. It is a powerful reminder of the devastating cost of pride, emotional distance, and taking those who hold us up for granted. King David learned that you cannot conquer a heart the way you conquer a territory, and Mira found her own strength in the ashes of his indifference. If you enjoyed this cinematic, dramatic alpha romance and want to dive into more intense, character-driven fiction, please leave a like, share this story with your fellow readers, and subscribe for future updates. Let me know in the comments below. Did you expect Mira to walk away? And what did you think of her final choice?